presentation was given at a policy forum titled Cannabis Use and Problem Gambling in Ontario Youth, co-hosted by GREO, Gambling Research Exchange Ontario, and the Ontario Centre of Excellence for Child and Youth Mental Health. Tara Elton-Marshall presents a summary of Ontario youth data, cannabis use and problem gambling. Dr. Tara Elton-Marshall is an independent scientist with the Institute for Mental Health Policy Research at CAMH, an assistant professor in the Clinical Public Health Division at the Dalla Lana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto, and an adjunct assistant professor in the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at Western University. Dr. Elton-Marshall evaluates addiction and substance use-related policies and programs with the goal of providing the evidence needed to strengthen future policy and programming, and thus reduce addiction and substance use problems. Her research, conducted in 7 countries to date, has provided the evidence base for restricting tobacco packaging and product design characteristics that increase misperceptions of reduced harm. She has examined factors associated with problem gambling among adolescents in 3 provinces, and she is the co-principal investigator of a study evaluating the impact of the legalization of online gambling in Ontario. This video has been narrated from a script developed from Dr. Elton-Marshall's presentation at the GREO Policy Forum on Cannabis Use and Problem Gambling in Ontario Youth on June 22, 2017. To begin this presentation, I want to acknowledge my investigator team, particularly related to the Youth Gambling Survey that I'm presenting, as well as the staff and the Propel Centre for Population Health Impact, who helped to coordinate the Youth Gambling Survey. I also want to acknowledge that we're presenting data from the Ontario Student Drug Use and Health Survey, which we call the OSDUHS, and want to thank the research team there and all their hard work that makes this possible. The OSDUHS is developed by the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health. When thinking about cannabis and problem gambling in relation to youth, we want to first identify what we really need to know. First of all, we need to know the rates of cannabis use among adolescents. If hardly anyone is actually using cannabis, then we wouldn't need to target our efforts and research there. Similarly, what are the rates of gambling among adolescents? If adolescents aren't really gambling, then perhaps this wouldn't be an important priority issue, and could be something we instead need to look at in the future. Next, we need to know what's happening in terms of the rates, whether they are increasing or decreasing or remaining stable. If they're increasing, then we can determine that something should be done very immediately. If they're decreasing, then maybe we can just start to plan a little bit more in terms of thinking about future policy changes. We additionally want to know whether or not marijuana use is even related to problem gambling when it comes to Ontario youth. We haven't really focused on Ontario yet, so we don't know if there's even an association in our context. And finally, a lot of the research has looked at whether or not marijuana use is related to problem gambling, but we also want to know whether the frequency of using marijuana is related to problem. So it's great that we have this opportunity in Ontario to have an ongoing surveillance mechanism through the OSDUHS, allowing us to be able to look at trends over time. In this presentation, I'll describe what the OSDUHS is, and then review what that survey has found in terms of the prevalence rate of cannabis use among adolescents in grades 7 to 12, how the use of cannabis has changed over time in Ontario, going all the way back to 1977, and how gambling has changed among adolescents in Ontario over time, as well as the prevalence rate for gambling in adolescents. In addition to being able to look at the OSDUHS survey, we also ran a study of youth gambling specifically, which was funded by GREO several years ago, called the Youth Gambling Study, or YGS. This was a representative study of adolescents in Ontario, which allowed us to explore issues around gambling more deeply. Additionally, because it was part of a larger survey, we were able to look at cannabis use in this population. For that item, we have students in grades 9 to 12, so a little bit older. We'll review the prevalence of gambling within the sample, and then finally we'll examine the association between cannabis use, gambling, and adolescence. To begin, we'll look at the OSDUHS. The majority of the data being presented today is part of the 2015 OSDUHS Drug Use Report. The full study is available online. To give an overview of this study, it's a repeated cross-sectional survey, so that's a snapshot in time, but they take a snapshot every 2 years. It's a survey of students in grades 7 to 12 in Ontario's publicly funded schools, so that means private schools are not included in the study sample. The survey not only measures cannabis use and gambling, but also other substance use, mental health measures, physical health, bullying, and other risk behaviors. From time to time, the authors change what's added to the survey to be able to respond to things that become emerging issues, such as energy drinks, for example. Another characteristic about the OSDUHS in relation to its ability to monitor over time is that it is one of the longest running surveys in the world, and the longest running survey in Canada. I'll go over the survey's design briefly since it's quite technical. The OSDUHS sample is cross-sectional and it's representative of grades 7 to 12 students in Ontario, using what's called a two-stage probability cluster sample. And that means they randomly select schools and then randomly select classrooms to make sure that it is representative, and the sample gets stratified by region. If they didn't stratify by region, had they just randomly selected the schools in Ontario, the sample would end up with too many schools from Toronto, for example, because there are more schools in Toronto. So when doing the selection, they divide the options into regions and randomly select an equal number from each region. Classes within schools are randomly selected, and any student in a classroom that is selected is given a consent form and is eligible to participate, assuming that their parents consent. It is a completely anonymous survey, which is very important when asking adolescents to report on this kind of behavior. It's about 30 minutes long, and with all the things the survey aims to measure, it can often be a challenge. For that reason, some questions only get asked in a subsample of the full sample. For example, the gambling questions don't go out to the entire sample. There's a random allocation who are asked that set of questions. The survey questionnaires are distributed by trained staff, which is also very important. In terms of ethics, the survey uses parental consent, so only those students whose parents agree to let them participate can actually participate in the study. The data being presented today is based on data that was collected between November 2014 and June 2015. As I mentioned, the OSDUHS occurs every 2 years, so the most recent survey with 2016 and 2017 data is just completed, so we don't have that data quite yet. There are 10,426 students in this sample. Now we'll be looking at what we know in terms of cannabis use prevalence rates and whether this is something we should be worried about. First of all, among students in grades 7 to 12, 21% said that they had used cannabis in the last year. That represents 203,900 students in Ontario that are using cannabis. That is a sizable chunk that we need to consider. There are no significant gender differences. The prevalence rates are virtually the same across males and females. Now, if we look at past year use and how it relates to other past year substance use, cannabis is number 3. The only thing that is more commonly used in the last year is alcohol and energy drinks. And there is a question as to whether or not energy drinks should be considered a substance. So at number 3, cannabis is slightly more common than binge drinking in the last month, which as you can see on this chart is at number 4. There can be some confusion with this data, as the overall survey is working with students in grades 7 to 12. However, the survey also asked about certain other drugs which were only asked of students in grades 9 to 12. This is because these drugs are less common, so it doesn't make sense to ask the whole sample because very few will have participated. As you can see on this slide, ecstasy is not very commonly used, for example, so was only asked of the older group. In terms of past year drug use by grade level, looking at the full sample of grades 7 to 12, the prevalence rate looks a little bit lower because you have a large sample of people that aren't really using it. The analysis shown here is for grades 9 to 12, and the prevalence rate is 28.1%. This is students who had used cannabis in the last year. And again, it's number 3 behind alcohol and energy drinks. Here we compare lifetime use and past year use. Lifetime use refers to having used it at least once in their lifetime. So on the left of this slide is lifetime use of various substances, and on the right is past year use for students in grades 7 to 12. 23.9% of adolescents had used cannabis in their lifetime, and 21.3% had used it just in the last year. What was also important is not just whether or not people try marijuana once and never again, but also how frequently they're using it. If we compare the frequency of use of cannabis compared to other drugs, this graph shows that 12.4% of the population are using cannabis 6 or more times in the last year. And that's much higher than the frequency of use for things like opioid pain relievers or over-the-counter cough and cold medications, which are also very common with adolescents. Again, this is students in grades 7 to 12, so could be skewed to be a slightly conservative number because of the younger people included in this sample. Now, among those who have used cannabis, how frequently are they using it? On this graph, cannabis use is at the top. So among only those who are cannabis users in grades 9 to 12, 47% had used it 10 or more times in the last year, 28% had used it 3 to 9 times in the last year, and 26% had used it 1 to 2 times in the last year. When compared to other drugs, cannabis is the most frequently used drug, and it demonstrates that generally, people are not typically using it only once and never again. They're using it more than once, and much more so compared to other drugs, where people might be experimenting in the last year and then never doing it again. This has important implications when we're trying to look at things like sustained impact on problem gambling, for example. Now, how frequently are they using in the past month? Of the population, 2.1% used marijuana daily. That represents 20,000 students in Ontario who are using cannabis daily. That again points to the profound impact we can have if we develop prevention strategies. 2.1% are using 3 to 6 times in a week, 2.1% are using 1 to 2 times in a week, and 6.9% are using 1 or 2 times in the whole year. We can also note that there may be issues of underreporting, which could be due to students not feeling comfortable disclosing the level to which, or that they are at all, engaging in activity considered illegal. And additionally, the possibility of missing data with school-based surveys, which could be due to students who may in fact be the most engaged in these activities not being in school at all. Based on those considerations, the numbers we have are likely a conservative estimate. Also to remember when we're looking at the OSDUHS data is that private schools are not included in the sample, only publicly funded schools. And we've seen data from another study, the CAMH study, led by Dr. Scott Leatherdale, which is a longitudinal survey of adolescents that has found students in private schools are more likely to be using drugs. This also leads us to believe the numbers we're seeing from the OSDUHS are likely underestimating the issue. It's also important to know when people start to initiate cannabis use, because that helps determine the critical time for intervention when developing prevention programming. We see from the OSDUHS data that there is a tendency for cannabis use to peak in grade 11 and then become stable. That tells us that any prevention programming should be starting sooner than that, ideally before grade 9, which is when the slope starts to increase, but definitely before grade 11. Now we want to think about how cannabis use has changed over time. Keeping in mind this data is from 2014-2015, so it will be interesting to see the follow-up data as well, given that our environment has changed. People are talking more about cannabis use, and it's much more prominent in the media, so we'll have to see what impact that will have. This slide shows data starting in 1977, and compared to the late 80s and early 90s, cannabis use has increased, but it has been decreasing in recent years, particularly since about 2001, which may be surprising, so it'll be interesting to see the follow-up wave and whether that downward trend is continuing. It's also interesting to see the significant difference from the late 80s to early 90s, and we're not sure what caused that, although there may be some literature on that. In terms of this recent decline since 2001, someone looking at this data may question whether some other substance has replaced cannabis for certain users, so that the rate of cannabis may decline, but the rate of other substance use may increase, or new substances may appear. So let's look at the profile for some other substances. Starting with cigarettes and alcohol. In general, alcohol use has declined over the same time, although it's still consistently higher than cannabis use. In terms of cigarette use, it's declined sharply, largely due to very effective efforts of controlling tobacco in Ontario. So now cannabis use has overtaken cigarette use in terms of prevalence. This graph shows the comparison of cannabis use to other substances. The line dotted with squares around the middle of the graph represents cannabis use over time. The short blue line represents energy drinks, which was just added to the survey as they became more popular. And the yellow line at the top represents alcohol use over time. Also shown here are binge drinking in the past month, prescription opioids, which is declining according to this data, cigarettes, inhalants, and salvia, ADHD drugs non-medical, which would be things such as Adderall, and this shows that there doesn't seem to be increases in these other substances, and so that it's unlikely that any other substances may be replacing cannabis. It appears to be a general decline. But this is why we need more research, especially longitudinal research, to understand which questions need to be asked. The average age of first use is also increasing, which is positive because one of the things that we might want to encourage in terms of prevention strategies is for people not to use cannabis until later, given all the brain development that is happening in that adolescent phase. The average age of first use is now over 15, which has gone up since the late 90s. Now, another important thing to consider is subpopulations. It may be the case that our overall trends show a decline, but that certain groups are not represented in that decline. We looked first at the total cannabis use, which is the first graph at the top left, with the orange line at the bottom representing people who had used 6 or more times in the last year. This mirrors the pattern that we saw overall in terms of cannabis use. Then we wanted to look at whether or not there were gender differences in cannabis use over time. We can see on the top right graph that in general, the pattern is that females, represented by the green line, are slightly less likely, or maybe slightly more likely at the very end around 2015, but a very similar pattern to males. When looking at the different grades individually, we can get a sense of how the younger group can skew the data. On the bottom left graph, looking at grade 7, the pattern has remained relatively stable and low. But looking at grade 9, there was a peak in the early 2000s, and then it's gone down since then. In grade 11, there's also been a decline, although not as sharply. And the overall prevalence in grade 11 is quite high at almost 40%. Finally, shown by the bottom right graph, we'd also like to know about regional differences, because certain regions could have more problems. But the data shows that over time, the regions have remained generally the same, with no disparities in terms of cannabis use. Ethnicity is another factor we may want to examine more, but it can be challenging when looking at the gambling-related outcomes, for example, to have enough subpopulations to even be able to look at those differences. But we will review some additional data on that in a moment. Now thinking about gambling prevalence. Is the prevalence of gambling something that we should be concerned about? We found that 32% of adolescents had gambled at all in the last year, which represents over 308,000 students in grades 7 to 12. We also note that there's a real disparity between males and females when it comes to gambling. It's much more popular among males. To further break it out in terms of different subpopulations, we have a few representations here. With the dots at the left end of the graph, corresponding to M and F on the x-axis, we have the gender effects. This is the average percentage of people reporting gambling, showing that males are much higher on the scale. The distribution of the dots in the middle, corresponding to G7, G8, G9, and so on, shows the variation by grade. There's a real grade effect, and that has an impact when we look at the overall prevalence rate for grades 7 to 12. By the time adolescents get to grade 12, 40% are gambling, which may not be that surprising because some of them are becoming of age to gamble and to be able to access all those opportunities. It further points to the critical importance of looking at this specific age group, particularly as they start transitioning out of high school. In terms of regional differences, there are also some key considerations to keep in mind. The dots at the right end of the graph correspond to the regional abbreviations on the x-axis. TO is Toronto, and N is Northern Ontario. So 42.5% of adolescents in Northern Ontario have gambled in the last year. This is much higher than Western Ontario, shown here as W, and Eastern Ontario, the E. That's an important difference, and we don't currently have an answer for why it's such a drastic difference. To clarify, the Northern Ontario results include anybody that's attending a school in Northern Ontario, although it does not include schools on First Nation reserves. Next, we ask, how has adolescent gambling changed over time? First of all, we looked at different gambling activities, and this graph shows that cards, represented by the yellow line, used to be more popular but has really declined, and that at this point, there isn't much difference in terms of the different types of gambling. The OSDUHS includes internet or online gambling, and as shown here by the red dotted line, the rates are still low. We do want to caution about interpretation of that because in the OSDUHS, the question is quite general. Have you gambled on the internet? However, in our work with the youth gambling study, we asked about specific forms of online gambling, and those results have much higher rates of online gambling. That's likely attributable to the fact that there are certain types of online gambling that people might not immediately think about when they're asked simply, have you gambled on the internet? This can be forms such as gambling on video games, which we found to be quite popular. How is that happening, and what does that look like? Those are some areas of online gambling that need further exploration. Here we have our subpopulations. And to summarize these subpopulation findings, with the total results in the top left graph, we can see that overall gambling has declined over time. When we look at gender in the top right graph, we find that males, represented by the blue line, are consistently gambling more than females, and that gap hasn't really changed. In terms of grade, shown on the bottom left, again we see an overall decline, but rates being higher in grade 12, represented by the dark blue line consistently at the top. Regional differences, shown on the bottom right graph, is most interesting, and that's where we see some problematic trends. The green line represents Northern Ontario. We can see that the rate of adolescents gambling has been increasing since 2005, but that rate has additionally increased between 2013 and 2015. That begs the question of what happened during that time period to see that increase. This trend is especially concerning because there are new casinos being built in those Northern Ontario communities, such as in Kenora and North Bay, so we'll be curious as to what impact that will have. Now we will review the youth gambling survey, which I led, in a bit more detail. Many of the methods we used were similar to what we saw with the OSDUHS. For the youth gambling survey, we had the great opportunity to add it as a supplement to an existing survey, the youth smoking survey, which is now called the CSTADS, which stands for Canadian Student Tobacco, Alcohol, and Drug Survey. The CSTADS uses adolescents in grades 9 to 12 in high schools, which are representative of 3 provinces, of which we are focusing on Ontario for this presentation. The sample is over 3,000 students. In terms of looking at problem gambling, we were able to use one of the first problem gambling measures that has been developed specifically for and tested specifically with adolescents. That is called the Canadian Adolescent Gambling Inventory, or CAGI, from which we used the 9-item Gambling Problem Severity Subscale, or GPSS. Without going into too much detail, it asks questions related to gambling and betting, as well as things that people have done because of their gambling and betting. We focused on current gambling, meaning anyone who had gambled in the past 3 months, which is what the CAGI uses as their time frame. Cannabis use was measured in the past year, and we're also able to look at frequency of cannabis use, which addresses some of the issues we discussed earlier. Now we'll drill down into some of the results. This data set was from 2012-2013. We found 32.5% of adolescents said they had ever used cannabis, meaning at least once in the past year. And a large number of students were using it frequently. 10.3% used once a week or more, and 15.8% used less than once a week. So this could be the people that would use it once every few months or just once a month, but not as often as once a week or more. Now we'll look at the results in terms of gambling prevalence. We found overall 41.7% of adolescents gambled in the last 3 months alone. In terms of scores on problem gambling, based on our CAGI measure, 2.1% of adolescents in Ontario were classified as being high risk severity, and 4% were low to moderate risk severity. Now, the purpose of this presentation is to examine the association between current cannabis use and gambling and problem gambling. So first of all, we can see that cannabis use is related to whether or not someone gambles. On this graph, the blue bars represent current gamblers, and the yellow bars represent not current gamblers. So 16.5% of people who are current gamblers use marijuana once a week or more. This is in comparison to 7.2% of people who were not gamblers who use marijuana once a week or more. Then, in terms of cannabis use, 17.8% of current gamblers use cannabis less than once a week, versus 13.2% of people who were not current gamblers using cannabis less than once a week. Now, what about the type of gambling that people engage in? We looked at land-based gamblers versus online gamblers, and how they compare to non-gamblers. And we found fairly startling results in terms of how it relates to cannabis use, particularly for frequent cannabis use, which is identified as once a week or more. It's important to note that online gambling is viewed as a sort of proxy for heavy involvement in gambling, because very few people strictly gamble online. It's usually added to multiple other forms of land-based gambling, so it can be a flag for more heavily involved gambling. Online gamblers are represented by the gray bar. Land-based gamblers are in blue, and non-gamblers are the yellow bars. Among online gamblers, 20.6% use cannabis once a week or more. This is compared to 13.2% of land-based gamblers using cannabis once a week or more. Now, how might marijuana use relate to problem gambling? On this graph, the group second from left is the group who use marijuana once a week or more. And the blue bar represents high problem gambling severity. Yellow represents low problem gambling severity, and the gray represents no problem. So among those who are high severity problem gamblers, 49.9% use marijuana once a week or more. This is in sharp contrast to people who scored low to moderate in terms of problem gambling severity score. 23.4% of those individuals use marijuana once a week or more, and significantly different than people who don't have a problem with gambling, of which only 8.6% used marijuana once a week or more. So there's a very strong correlation there. We additionally ran some statistical models that we'll review here. We did a logistic regression analysis, and this allows us to control for covariates that might in fact be accounting for all of these correlations. For example, it may be that we just have a particular subgroup influencing the results, so we want to control for all of that. This graph is looking at problem gambling as an outcome. Clearly, what predicts problem gambling the most is whether or not someone has friends who gamble. If someone has friends who gamble, their odds are 682.2% higher of having a problem with gambling compared to people who don't have friends who gamble. But what we're really interested in is whether or not cannabis use matters. First, we looked at ever cannabis use, meaning did they use it at least once in the time frame. This is represented by the bar at the far left. Ignoring the 682%, we can see that it's quite high, and in fact higher than all of the other variables in terms of its association to problem gambling. So among those who ever used cannabis, the odds of being a problem gambler are 72.7% higher than those who didn't use cannabis. So again, a strong correlation. Other things that were correlated: gender, which is shown by the yellow bar at the far right, at negative 63.9%. So we know females are less likely to be problem gamblers. Ethnicity, and for this study, due to our small sample size, we could only measure ethnicity based on white versus all other categories. However, we do find a significant difference shown by the yellow bar at negative 43%, which means that people who are ethnic minorities are significantly more likely to have problems with gambling. Having a friend who gambles, which is the strongest correlation, but also having a parent who gambles increases the chances of having problems with gambling by 61.7%. Next, we wanted to look at whether or not the frequency of cannabis use matters. A few slides back, we looked at the correlation of those who are in the category of using cannabis once a week or more, having a higher association with problem gambling. We tested that in this model as well. And again, aside from the fact that friends who gamble are a strong factor, we can see this bar second from the left, which represents the group that use cannabis at least once a week, is dramatically higher than all those other categories. If someone uses cannabis once a week or more, their odds of being a problem gambler were 159% higher compared to those who didn't use cannabis. What's also interesting is that there was no significant association when it came to those who use cannabis less than once a week. So it's really the frequent users that we need to look at in terms of the relationship between cannabis use and problem gambling. Also interesting, people who responded "don't know" to the cannabis use question also had higher odds of being problem gamblers. This could get back to the issue about whether or not people want to volunteer their cannabis use, so it would be interesting to know who those "don't know" people are. Now to quickly summarize everything we've looked at. Cannabis use is common. 1 in 5 adolescents are using it, and it's even higher when you look at grades 9 to 12, at 28.1%, and it's just as prevalent for males and females. It's more common than past month binge drinking and other drug use, and even surpassed cigarette use. The average age of initiation has increased, which is a positive, but it means that in terms of prevention programming, we need to get in before grade 11. And use has been declining over time since 1999. However, frequent use is common, and given what we've seen in terms of the relationship between frequent use and problem gambling, that's something we should be worried about. Approximately 20,000 adolescents using cannabis daily is a concern, and another 10% using at least weekly. 32% of adolescents had gambled in the last year, but that figure was higher for males. Additionally, the issue with Northern Ontario is something to highlight to explore further. So we know that ever cannabis use, meaning having used it at least once, is associated with more likelihood of problem gambling. There are problems with looking at ever use because it doesn't differentiate between people that may just be experimenting versus a more regular user. Frequency of use is very significant. People who are using cannabis once a week or more are more likely to be current gamblers, they're more likely to gamble online, and they are more likely to be problem gamblers. And this association is still true even after we control for all these other important covariates. In terms of implications then, cannabis use and gambling have been declining over time, but all of this data is before two dramatic changes in terms of the usage environment. This data was collected before the legalization of online gambling occurred, and we have yet to start understanding the impact for adolescents. The data also precedes the upcoming legalization of marijuana. We really need some tracking systems to see what the impact of these policies are and will be over time. Now, to briefly mention another project I'm working on that was recently funded by Ontario's Ministry of Health to develop a prevention strategy related to online gambling. What many people may not know is that in the current curriculum documents, there is a section that says that there should be online gambling prevention taught in schools, but we don't really know what that should look like. The purpose of this new study is to inform our prevention strategy related to gambling, and online gambling specifically. It means that we're going to put new questions into the OSDUHS, and we're also going to be doing another follow-up survey of an adult population study, where we've been looking at online gambling in a longitudinal sample over time. This will hopefully provide some new insights and an opportunity to answer some of the applied research questions we've been discussing to be able to make a real impact. And that concludes this presentation. Thank you, and thank you to GREO for funding the Youth Gambling Survey, which helped inform this work. Thank you for watching this presentation, a summary of Ontario youth data, cannabis use, and problem gambling, by Dr. Tara Elton-Marshall, which was part of the GREO Policy Forum on Cannabis Use and Problem Gambling in Ontario Youth on June 22, 2017.